Good morning and welcome to the latest edition of my studio poetry diary. I'm Chris Kent, and it's been my practice for a while now to try and start every working day as an actor by reading a poem aloud. And before I head into the studio today, I'm looking at a poem which seems to speak particularly powerfully to our present moment. It's called At Quinam Bay. It's by the great Caribbean writer Eric Merton Roach, who was born on the island of Tobago in 1915 and died off the coast of Trinidad in 1974 in circumstances which are inextricably linked with the composition of this poem, as we shall see. Eric Roach was a writer of tremendous breadth and humanity and technical finesse, nowhere near as well known as he should be. He wrote about many things, but the focus of his work was his experience of colonialism as the direct descendant of African slaves. And this poem, At Quinam Bay, takes its title from the location on the southern coast of Trinidad, which is the arrival point for three separate but connected journeys within the poem. First, he imagines Christopher Columbus arriving there in 1498, stumbling across the islands as he sought the landmass of southern and Central America to plunder for gold. And then the later journeys of the reeking hulks of the slavers who also arrived at Quinam Bay, and finally his own arrival there on a journey he intends to take. Of course, in the traditional European narrative, Christopher Columbus, or Cristobal Colon, the Spanish name which Eric Roach also uses for him in this poem, is said to have discovered the Americas and the Caribbean islands. But the point of much of Eric Roach's work is to point out that not only did this so-called New World already exist and was inhabited by indigenous peoples, but that the process of colonization, of colonialism that Columbus, or Colon, initiated was to lead to the horrors of the slave trade, which flourished over the next 350 years. And indeed, by the end of the 18th century, the notorious slave triangle, which saw British goods transported to Africa, where they were exchanged for human cargo in the form of slaves, who were then forcibly shipped to the Caribbean, and then the crops they grew, cotton, sugar, and tobacco, were shipped back to British ports. By the end of the 18th century, this accounted for as much as 80% of our foreign trade income, wealth which, of course, has come down to us in our modern economy today. And it's the weight of this inheritance which is felt so viscerally in this poem. Eric Roach brilliantly uses the language of sickness and nausea to present this inheritance as a form of disease or pestilence which afflicts everybody in the poem. The enslaved themselves, of course, whom he describes as wondering whether they have arrived in hell, having crossed the river Acheron, one of the 5 rivers of the underworld in classical mythology, of course, but also how it debases the humanity of the slavers themselves, and indeed all of those who have followed. The poem itself technically is a masterpiece of compression. He uses long sentences spread across short lines, which means the use of enjambment, as we were talking about in the previous episode, when the sense of a sentence goes across the end of a line, and it presents the challenge for the reader in that we have to get the span of these long sentences while still maintaining the pulse and rhythm of the verse, which has the effect of almost of the waves, the relentlessness of the waves. It's conservatively estimated that over the period of the slave trade, 11 million people were transported from Africa, of whom probably 1.4 million may have died in transit. Perhaps in the end, this inheritance and the need to keep explaining it was overwhelming for Eric Roach. On the morning of April the 17th, 1974, he tidied his desk, leaving his final 2 poems, of which this is one, and set out on the journey he describes in this poem, heading south to the town of Siparia, where he references the statue of the Black Madonna, known locally and venerated as Sopori Mai, and then on to Mendez, before finally arriving at Quinam Bay. There he ingested the bottle of insecticide he had brought with him and simply swam out into the blue waters of the Caribbean. His fellow Caribbean poet, Nobel Prize winner Derek Walcott, said of Eric Roach, he went swimming to Africa, but he grew tired. He chose that way to reach his ancestors. At Quinam Bay. Sopori Mai is still maintained in her south town of quiet ways and modest means, and south from there, beyond Mendez, in a green plain of old oil wells and planted teak, it is Land's End in Quinam Bay. The roads, a black canal to sea, where Colon's schooners rolled offshore, and his boats were lugged to land, cleaving the indifferent wave. Columbus, weary of the sea, of tossing in eternity on Atlantic's murderous wastes, was sick in flesh and sick at heart to plunder heathen golden kingdoms of a glittering continent. But after hellish wastes of seas, God rewarded him with islands. Slavers from the Guinea coast beyond horizon stumbled reeking to this bay, disgorging cargoes of sick slaves who knew not where on earth they stood, or maybe hell. Had they crossed the Acheron? The slavers' crews were sick to soul, with shipping men like beasts in chains, bound beneath decks, grievous voyages, fouling breath and fouling spirit. A stink, a moaning marred their dreams. Years afterward, they could not eat for smelling filth and hearing groans, nor love a woman in a bed for memories of riven folk, manacled at hand and foot to the beams on which they lay, wallowing in their grievous dung. The very ocean vomited as each slaver clove her way from Guinea to the Caribbees. He's seen and known and done too much. Bone-weary as Colon himself, soul-wretched as the slavers' crews, heart-sick as any dying slave, he walks to bay. Every dream he dreamed long drowned, every love sunk underground, every vision vanished. Will the sea yield him quiet death? Wake him a ghost of the despairs of all the dead who trafficked here?